This is the Drum Tuning Guru. The Drum Tuning Guru is brought to you by The Music Factory, www.themusicfactoryoc.com.
Hey everybody, Danny here, and here's my interview with Roy Burns. Thanks everybody for tuning in. This is episode number 4 of the Drum Tuning Guru. Real happy I got a legend here with me, not only as a great drummer, but also a clinician, manufacturer, author. Very happy to have Roy Burns here. Thanks for joining us.
Nice to be here. Nice to see you.
So, Roy, just for some of the younger listeners that might not be as familiar with your long history, why don't you give us a little rundown of who you are and what you do?
Well, I grew up in Emporia, Kansas, and it was very difficult to get information about drumming or about the music business. No long-playing records, no TV sets, no information that was readily available. So I was taking lessons by going to Kansas City, Missouri, a 4.5-hour train ride in each direction. And I met Louis Belson there. He said, "Kid, you're as good as you're going to get if you stay in Kansas. Go to New York or LA and study." So I went to New York and did the usual bit of trying to survive there, and eventually got on Benny Goodman's band. I auditioned for the band by going up to Carnegie Hall Studios. There were just 3 of us, drums, piano, and clarinet. Benny said, "Let's play Lady Be Good." We played one tune after another for 2 hours. Nobody said anything. I wondered what the heck is going on. And then he turns to me and he says, "Be at the Waldorf tonight, wear a dark suit." Well, I didn't know where the Waldorf was, and I only had one suit. Fortunately, it was a dark suit. So I get up there, and I'm sitting up in the corner, and they play a dance set, a concert set, and a dance set. Then the manager comes up and says, "Benny wants you to play the next concert set." Well, I didn't bring any drumsticks or anything. Mousy Alexander was the drummer. So I go down to meet him, and I said, "Well, Benny wants me to play the next concert set." He said, "Well, I'm leaving the band anyway. I've already given my notice. I'll help you go through the music." He said, "This is a heck of a way to audition in front of a live audience on somebody else's drums and sight reading." I said, "Well, I'll give it a shot, you know." So I did pretty well. Benny hired me, and I met a lot of great musicians through that band.
I'm sure.
And I eventually wound up doing a lot of studio work, like the Merv Griffin Show, Tonight Show, quiz shows, whatever was available. I was playing anything I could to make a living.
Yeah.
And,
on my way over here, or earlier today, I listened to a recording of a drum solo called Timetable.
Oh, yes.
Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Like, do you remember where that recording
That was in
been made?
Chicago at the Midwest Band Conference with the Vandercook College Band.
What year was that?
I think it was around 1963.
Oh, right.
64,
Sounded great.
somewhere. Yeah, that was a good night. And I was wiped out after the thing. And Lenny DiMuzio, who was with Zildjian at that time, now with Sabian, came up and helped me get down to the coffee shop where I could recover, because I kind of overdid it, you know. But one of the things that always kept me going was I had a good basis as a young student. I studied piano a little bit, and I'd taken lessons and I could read.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I was asked to play that set with Benny Goodman, no one asked me, "Can you read music?" They just assumed I could. And I looked like I was about 15, you know.
Yeah.
I weighed 119 pounds, soaking wet. But from that band and the musicians I met through it, that's how I got into studio work, doing television shows and stuff. Then at one point in the early 60s, I wrote an elementary drum book. And it sort of took off.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started getting clinic requests. So I go to the Midwest Band Conference in Chicago, the same place where the Vandercook College Band I recorded with, but this was earlier. And I walk into this little theater, and there's a security guard there, and the drums are there. He says, "Can I help you?" I said, "I'm here for the drum clinic." He said, "Well, you have to wait till this guy Burns gets here. So you can't touch anything." I said, "Well, I'm his valet. I'm his drum tech. I set up the drums for him and tune them." He said, "Okay, but I'm a drummer, so I'm going to watch you, and if you do anything wrong, I'll know it." I said, "Okay." So I get the drums tuned up, get everything positioned, then I played something around the drum set as fast as I could. The guy says, "That was amazing. How long have you been playing?" I said, "About 6 weeks." I said, "If you think that was good, well, this guy Burns gets it." So I came back down after 2 hours and changed clothes, and he's standing in the wings saying, "I want to talk to you." But he was a good sport about it. I said, well, you weren't going to let me set up the drums. I had to do something, yeah.
I specifically remember starting off, I think, in the school band, with my practice pad and sticks, and it was your book.
Oh, that's right.
And I'm sure that's the case for so many people. One of the things that I read is that you're really kind of credited as being like one of the first clinicians.
I was the first full-time artist clinician in the music industry.
It's amazing.
Yeah. And,
over the years, you've, been a teacher and stuff. And, again, for some of the people that might not be so familiar with you, I mean, you span everything from, classic jazz all the way through modern stuff. So it wasn't Josh Freese a student of yours?
Yes. Nick DiVirgilio is one of my students.
Mm-hmm.
Josh is the most well-known one.
Yeah.
Terrific talent.
I've seen in multiple interviews and conversations with him that he always credits Roy Burns. So that's quite an honor, I'm sure. So how did you go from, as your career moved on and, how did you get into manufacturing and into accordion?
Well, when I was working at Rogers Drums, people knew I was doing the clinics for them. What they didn't know was I was working with the research and development department, with engineers, with the advertising agency, working with salesmen, doing product presentations and all that stuff. So I was really involved in the total business, which few people knew about. So one day I came home and I told my wife, I said, I think I'm going to start my own company. She said, you must be crazy. I said, well, I can't be any dumber than the guys that are ruining Rogers Drums because they're running it into the ground. And I have a partner, Ron Marquez, who had agreed to do the manufacturing. And we started Aquarian Accessories. And it was pretty rough in the beginning. It was harder than I thought it would be.
Sure.
But I thought I can't be any dumber than these other guys that were messing everything up before, because Rogers Drums was the most innovative drum company of all time. They have, today, everything you see on a drum kit probably was originally on a Rogers drum kit, all the hardware in particular, So that's how I got involved in it. But
and when you guys first started, was it Drumheads or was it more like peripheral accessory items?
It was accessories. Our first product was a cymbal spring.
Oh, okay.
And we had some other things like the graphite drumsticks and cymbal bags and stick bags, stuff like that. And then one day, Ron and I were talking, and he said, how would you like to make drumheads? I said, well, what made you think of that? He said, well, every time we go to a show, I notice that guys are always coming over to you and saying, Roy, why don't you make drumheads? We need something else on the market. What could you do with it? So what got us started was I brought in some calf drumheads, and I told Ron, these heads were real easy to tune. They never had a tuning problem with calf drumheads because the heads were so pliable, they would stretch, and they would correct themselves. So you really couldn't get a bad sound. It was just a question of how tight or how loose or what pitch you wanted. So the tuning was never a big deal. Even if you tuned it incorrectly, the head would stretch and it would level itself out because it was so pliable. The problem was, if it rained, you didn't want to go to work because the heads would be so loose it absorbed all the moisture. I used to work at the Metropole in New York City, and they had the big glass doors open to the street in the summer. So the first two sets, the drums were too tight to play on. The third and fourth set, they were just right. And the last two sets, they were too loose. And if you kept retuning them, you could go crazy.
Gotcha.
So we noticed that one of the problems with tuning, the difficulty started with plastic drum heads because there was no problem prior to that. And one of the key things that we discovered was the preformed corner in the collar. And it doesn't always line up with the bearing edge on the drum because not every drum company makes the bearing edge the same way, as you well know.
Right.
So we thought, how are we going to get around that? Because we realized that was one of the problems. Well, we came up with a sound curve collar design, which is round. So when you tighten it down against the bearing edge, your bearing edge forms the collar in the Aquarian head. So it's a custom fit. And you never get that wrinkle on one side that you can't get out and stuff like that. Then the other problem is the slipping inside the hoop is what causes the detuning. It's not so much the mylar stretching. Mylar is pretty tough stuff. It's really polyester film. But DuPont named it mylar so they could trademark it. So we noticed that the slippage inside the hoop was the problem. So we came up with a T-channel that's in the bottom of the hoop that prevents the resin and the head from slipping. So our heads don't detune. So we solved 2 or 3 of the major problems for most drummers, which is why we were successful even as a small company starting out on a shoestring, you know.
Gotcha. That's one of the big things that I notice using Aquarian Drumheads is they're real consistent. So when I put those heads on, I don't really have to do a whole lot.
Right.
I can put it on, give it a little push to seat it a little bit, and start my tuning process, and I'm there quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with some of the other heads, there's much more stretching and retuning and kind of a whole seating process, and it takes time.
Well,
so is that collar, the process you were just talking about, that is making that...
the seating idea is somewhat of a myth.
Mm-hmm.
See, the problem is the collar, the corner in the head, the sharp corner, doesn't line up with the bearing edge. So when you're pushing on it or over tightening it, you're trying to stretch the head to get it to conform to the bearing edge.
Mm-hmm.
We eliminate that problem by not putting a corner there. So you just tighten it down, and then the bearing edge forms the collar, just like a calf drum head. That's where we got the idea.
Gotcha.
And then the fact that it doesn't slip inside the hoop was the other major achievement.
Mm-hmm.
We have the only patented hoop in the industry.
You were starting to talk about the misinformation and some of the simplest techniques that you've discovered and used over the years for drum tuning. So with regards to the snare drum?
You want the bottom head tight enough that when you press on it with your thumb about an inch in from the edge, it gives a little. If it's tabletop hard, it'll be choked. If it's spongy, it'll be too loose. Now the bottom head has to work with the snares. So if the bottom head is too loose and you tighten the snares, you choke the drum. So the bottom head has to be moderately tight. Then the top head can be tuned loose, medium, or tight, depending on the sound you want. If you tune the top head first and then try to adjust the bottom head, you go slightly crazy because you can't do it that way. It just won't work. So if you get the bottom head set and get it even, then your top head is just a question of personal taste and the style you want. Mm-hmm. As long as you have about the same tension at each tension screw. Then on the tom-toms, the bottom head is medium. And again, the top head can be wherever you want it as long as you tune the bottom head first. That gives the individual player a lot of leeway. Mm-hmm. But generally speaking, the resonant head should be tighter than the top. Most players agree on that. Mm-hmm. Now, if you tune both heads the same, which I think is probably impossible, but if you could tune the top and the bottom end of the tom-tom the same, you would get a unison, which would be a very thin sound. Like concert cymbals are a minor third apart. Mm-hmm. Your hi-hats, the bottom one is heavier than the top one, so they're a different pitch. So you get a blend or a mixture of frequencies. So when you have the bottom head tighter and the top medium to medium tight, as long as it's a little looser than the bottom head, you get a rich mixture of frequencies. The drum will sound full.
Excellent.
Now, if you could, when I say if you could, I've never heard anybody actually tune both heads exactly the same. But if you had both the same thicknesses, the same style, if you had top and bottom, theoretically you could do it, but it wouldn't be a good result. Mm-hmm. Now, if you do those basic things in practice, see, the problem is when a guitar player goes and take a guitar lesson, first thing he does is take the guitar out and tune the guitar.
Right.
Every time he practices, he tunes the guitar. So he's practicing tuning on a daily, hourly basis. The drummer puts the head on the drum, goes to the lesson, plays on the pad at the studio, goes home and leaves that head tension the same way and plays on it until he breaks it. Then it's a crisis. My God, what am I going to do?
Right.
Who's going to help me tune my drums? So just getting some practice doing it, I think, as you found out, just doing it a lot will help a great deal.
Well, and it's interesting that you mentioned the guitar tuning thing because I use that example a lot. And what I think, and we can kind of talk about this, that drummers have to understand is, even with it's great that guitar players have the luxury of an electronic tuner. The string is either in the right pitch or it is not. There's really no in between. Right. Drums is a little more subjective in that tone. But what I think drummers focus on so much is, because like you said, there's so much information out there, and basically if they're looking at YouTube and reading books, everything is basically centered around one thing: tensioning the head and getting the lugs to sound the same. That's really the only thing, for the most part, that you see people talk about. And to me, that's like putting the guitar through the guitar tuner. Right. You can do that, and it'll be in tune, but then when you plug it into the amp, if you don't understand tone, you can still have a horrible tone out of that guitar amp. You've scooped all the mid-range out or whatever that amateur guitar player is doing. you can do the exact same thing, with the drum. You could spend an hour tensioning, the tension rods and getting them equal, but, you could have those two heads pitched so dramatically different that the tone of the drum is bad,
right,
or too tight or too loose. And I feel like drummers need to think about, the tone almost more than the tensioning of the
the shell may not be perfect.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they do vary.
Sure.
And sometimes you have to adjust the head to make up for a deficiency in the bearing edge.
Right.
I mean, bearing edges are not perfect. Some are better than others. So that's a factor. And then while you're playing, let's suppose one tension screw loosens up on the bottom of the tom-tom, you're suddenly getting boring.
Mm-hmm.
You say, what happened?
Right.
You have to know what to look for.
Sure. Absolutely.
And but I had a guy call me up one time and said, I got one of your snare drum heads. I put it on my drum set and it sounds horrible on my snare drum. I said, what did you do? He said, well, I used so-and-so's tuning method. I said, tell me what the method was. He said, you tune the bottom head a third lower than the top head. I said, that's exactly opposite of the way you should tune it.
Yeah.
Tighten the bottom head, have the top head medium, and then call me back. He says, wow, you were right. Well, 20 years of experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I think, unfortunately for the drummers, especially young drummers, it's easy to buy a $20 guitar tuner, and at least you're going to be in the ballpark. And so much of drum tuning is experience and developing an ear and things like that. Even if you can take some of those basics and apply it, that will get you to a certain level at least. But it's just not taught, and it's a great point that you brought up, that when you go to your drum lesson, that's not what they teach you the first day. No. Whereas in the guitar lesson, that's absolutely the first thing
has to be
that they're going to teach you. Now, what do you think about the concept? When I talk to a lot of drummers about drum tone, it comes to me, it seems like that most of them are just listening for the wrong things, and have the wrong perspective on what their drums should sound like when they sit at them, to have it sound the way that, like they go to see some drummer play or a band, and they're like, man, those drums sound great. And they don't put two and two together and understand the perspective of what it sounds like to be in the audience listening to a drummer in a band or solo versus sitting behind that kit.
Okay, I can help you with that, or I can help some people with that. One of the problems is, if you look at a guitar, again, as a good example, the most resonant string is the bottom string, not the top string. So high sounds don't travel very far. Low sounds travel a great distance. That's why they use a foghorn at sea, because that low pitch will travel over the water for miles. Whereas a fire engine has a high-pitched siren, because it's coming around the corner. It's going to be right on top of you before you know it. So the idea is that out in front, everything sounds deeper and fuller than it does where you sit. Also, you hear more ring from the drums where you sit than you do out in the audience. Now, if you go home and tune your drums in your bedroom or wherever, your garage, wherever you practice, and tune them like they sounded 30 rows back from the stage, you're going to muffle the heck out of them. When you take them out in person, you're not going to get any sound.
Exactly. So
you have to, one of the good experiences is to get a friend of yours to play the drums, and you back off at a distance and hear them.
Mm-hmm.
That'll give you a better perspective, because sitting behind them, you're going to hear more high end or more ring than you do out in front. Now, the other problem with that is, let's say you're at the sound check, you hit the snare drum, and the sound man comes over and says, that drum is ringing too much. You say, no, it isn't. He said, yes, it is. Well, what the sound engineer is hearing is the distortion in the frequencies of that drum, the way it's tuned, or however the drum is manufactured. So if there's a distortion in the overtone series, he's going to hear it magnified with electronic equipment, whereas the guy with his ear may not hear it as much. However, if the head is even and the bearing edge is good, then you're going to get a more even series of frequencies. And so a lot of times you wind up in an argument with the sound engineer, because he's hearing the distortion more than the drummer is. The problem out in the audience is you don't hear that at all, because the guy's going to adjust the sound system, or let's say if it's acoustical, the drummer is going to play the drum, and out in front you don't hear that high-end frequency.
Gotcha.
So that gets you very confused when you go to tune your drums. They say, my drums don't sound like the guy did at the concert or the nightclub last night.
Right.
So it's good to hear your stuff from out front.
Yeah, one of the things that a very simple thing that I'll demonstrate in a clinic is, tune up a 12-inch rack tom and, have somebody strike at one time and we say, okay, listen, to the resonance of that
Right.
drum. And some of you, or probably most of you listening, think that drum is ringing too much.
Right.
And then I'll have a guitar player there with his guitar and I'll say, hit an E chord for me. And while that E chord's ringing, I'll hit that tom. And I'll say, boy, did you guys hear all the ring from the drum? Well, you're not hearing it. There's, now that it's mixed in with music, some of those things, and I think that drummers tend to, like you're saying, be listening to, well, what does it sound like on the record? And then they sit down and try to do that and end up with drums that just have tape and, padding and so much muffling on it, trying to recreate that sound and not understanding, well, those drums you like on the record, that, you need to understand what those sounded like when they went into the studio.
Yeah, because they play a lot of games in the studio to alter the sound or enhance it. Well, I've got some interesting news for drummers. We have a new process of vacuuming the air out between the two plies of a 2-ply head. No one else can do it. One of the problems is, like a 12-string guitar, the 2 strings that play the same note have to be really in tune. The biggest problem with 2-ply heads is to avoid wrinkles and air pockets. Well, we've developed this method, which is a trade secret, of vacuuming the air out. We have a new tom-tom head which answers the problem you're just talking about, called Force 10. It's 2 10 mil instead of 2 7 mil. And the 2 plies are absolutely even. So what you get is a good attack, a nice warmth, and a quick decay. So you got da, and it's over with, but it's not choked. You're not getting dong, which drives the sound guy crazy. And that's a new thing that we've done. And the same thing with a new snare drum head called Triple Threat, which is 3 7 mil. Wow. It's a 3-ply head, and yet it's sensitive. Again, because the plies are so even with our molding techniques, we can do this. And that solves a lot of problems. Like if you have a lively snare drum, you're always putting tape on it to get rid of the high-pitched ring. The trouble when you do that is now the drum has no tone quality.
Right.
This head solves that problem.
Do you feel, has technology hurt or helped drum sound, and or has it hurt or helped the young drummers that are coming up trying to put their drum sound together?
Okay, let's talk about when I first started recording in the late 50s and early 60s. In my previous lifetime, I call it. We got in the studio, an 18-piece band, and big band, and the trumpets are coming in like da-da-da, when I've got to hit da-da-da right with them. Except in the studio, I hear bop. The trumpets are that late because they're on the other side of the room. But when I hear the playback, it's thump. My rim shot and the trumpet note are exactly together. So you had to play hearing them late, holding your position so it would come out right on the recording.
Wow.
It could drive you crazy.
I don't know if very many drummers could do that nowadays.
Well, it was either that or you didn't get to record.
Right.
So, but what happened was everybody had to play at the same time. Now that means you had to get one good take where 18 people all played their part right. If one guy goofed, you had to redo it. We got up to take 28 one time, and you could cut the air with a knife. The guy finally said to the conductor, "Let's come back to this later." And you could hear a big sigh of relief. So, but it made you more aware. Like when you would record something, you play a drum break, you hear the drum break back, say, "Oh, that didn't sound too good." And yet some other little thing you played which was pretty simple sounded good. So you edited yourself. Well, you try the next take, and you altered the drum break to what sounded good rather than what you thought was going to be impressive. So there was the commonality of the experience. The other thing was the guy conducting the day, or the conductor or the band leader would come and say, "Hey, Roy, what do you think we could play on this tune? I like this feel. What do you got, And you would contribute. Well, I could try this beat. I could do that. And they say, well, that's good. Now they do a track in the guy's home studio, and he emails it to another city. So you've lost the interplay of the musicians. I think that's been the greatest bad thing that's happened to music, is the technicians and the new equipment has taken the interplay between the musicians out of the picture to a large degree. And that's why we have such goofy sounding records now.
I on the most recent, the second most recent record that I just did, we went back to, and this band has always done it that way, where we do drums, bass, rhythm guitar track, straight ahead, one time through, 3.5 minute song, somebody makes a mistake, we do it over,
right.
Find that one track and go with it from there. And it's interesting when I talk to other, contemporary, drummers of my age group and whatever, that's just such an odd way to do it now.
Right.
Like you're saying, that we didn't Frankenstein the drum fills together and, and do it that way. The other way that I think, it's impacted thing is, in a lot of ways, a lot of the younger drummers, when they go in the studio now, haven't really been forced to learn how to make their drums sound good, because most likely the engineer is going to put samples on everything.
Right.
Whereas it used to be, in the studio you have to have a high-end drum set. It has to be tuned well. The room has to be tuned well, and we're going to spend X amount of time getting that sound.
Right.
Whereas now, guys, they can go in with whatever almost on the drums, and they're going to sound replace everything later, so they're not even so worried about it, at the time of the recording. And that's another issue that's impacted those drummers, that they're not really forced to learn how to make those drums sound good.
Well, the problem for the young drummer is, how do I get a sound that I heard on a particular record? And they'll call up here and ask us, like Chris Adler or somebody, like, which heads does he use? Well, we'll tell them which heads he uses, but when you listen to the recording, if it's not a live recording, if it's in the studio, we don't know what they did in there, or what they did to alter the sound. Maybe a great effect, and maybe exactly what the artist wanted, but the poor kid at home, he has no idea how to get that sound, and he doesn't have the equipment to get it. So it makes us appear sometimes like we don't know as much as we should, because we can't tell the guy, well, they did this and they did that and they added this and they took this out and they corrected that and they overdubbed this. I mean, what comes out the other end is very different than what was actually being played in the studio. And that's a problem.
Have you used like a drum dial or any of those tools before?
I never used any of them. I never have.
Do you think there's some credibility to those things, or?
Well, if it helps you get in the ballpark quickly, that would help. But with an Aquarian Drumhead, I hate to be commercial, you can take the head out of the box and tap with a drumstick and you get doom. It's already in tune. You just have to get to the pitch you want and make sure it's tensioned evenly. Right. So we've eliminated most of those problems. But I guess that isn't the answer to your answer.
No, not at all. I'm just more curious to see how you feel about those things. I go back and forth with those things. I have a drum dial in my arsenal. I use it for a certain thing, but I don't use it in the way that most people do. I use it to get the head back to the relative tension that I had it before I changed the drum head. So when I have my drums dialed and it's sounding great, I've made that mistake of I changed both snare heads 30 minutes before a show, and I just didn't get them. I did my normal procedure, but I just didn't get them to the same pitches that I normally have. It wasn't
exactly where you had it before.
And I could tell in the show, I was like, the snare's not sounding very good. And it was a traveling festival where we were playing show after show after show. And after I said, to the sound guy that night, I said, my snare drums sound a little messed up. And I said, you can tell me. And he went, yeah, and turned and walked away. So I knew I had done it wrong. And that's what made me think, well, if I get my drums dialed, then I could check the overall tension.
Yeah.
And then I know that from that point forward. I realize that's not how most people try to use that tool. And just doing what I like to do with kind of being obsessed with drum tone a little bit, I'll try any of those things to see if I think there's a credible element to it. I just, I had done a post on Facebook that I was coming here to talk to you, and someone posted a link on a new product called the TuneBot, which looks to be almost like an electronic guitar tuner for drums. So that's going to be debuted at NAMM, and I'll be kind of interested to check it out.
Sure.
I don't know enough about it to really comment. My initial feeling is that that's not going to work. Just reading about the way they're explaining it, I don't think it's going to really
One of the
work.
problems is if you get a drum head that's got an uneven collar design, or it's higher on one side than another, or there's a wrinkle in the head because the film is not evenly within the hoop, how does that affect the tuner?
Mm-hmm.
Now, my attitude is if you can help yourself get a better sound faster and it works for you, why not use it? I'm very open-minded about that.
Sure.
The other thing is you shouldn't be dependent on something like that. You want to use it as a tool to help you develop your ear, because music comes down to what we hear. And the technicians and all the equipment that helps you get there is good, as long as you don't get to be one of those guys like, I don't have my tuner with me, I can't play. You know, I broke a head, I got to tune a drum head all on my own. You want to be able to do it by ear as well as use whatever is going to help you, I would think.
Right. So you mentioned a couple of new products. We're maybe 3 or 4 weeks out of NAMM right now, I guess. What is it? The
About 4 weeks.
January 22nd this year. Anything else you're going to debut at NAMM that you could clue us in on now ahead of time?
We have a new product called the On-Head, which is an electronic pad, which you can play silently, and with the headphones hear any kind of drum sound you want. So you can practice at home in the middle of the night reasonably without offending your neighbors or calling the police, you know. Or if you're just in an apartment, you can practice and control the volume. Then we have what's called the In-Head, which is a 2-ply head with the electronics in between the 2 plies. So the head can be played acoustically at a drum sound or electronically. Now what's good about this is it can convert your acoustical kit into an electronic kit for much less money than buying an electronic drum set.
Right.
And even if the heads do wear out when you replace a head, you're still not investing that much money.
Right.
And you have the, let's say you're playing a Broadway show and they do a little trio thing with a singer, you can play the drums acoustically. The next thing is a heavy metal rock tune, you throw a switch and you have electronic drums. That's never been available before.
Right.
So those 2 things are very important.
Yeah, I did. I think you showed kind of an early version of it last year, correct?
Yeah, we had prototype.
And, you know, the thought and the discussion that was going around a little bit was also, you know, just from a triggering standpoint, instead of, you know, having to apply some type of acoustic trigger to your kit, being able to use that to trigger kick drum samples live, or even in the studio, triggering a kick and snare, you know, as opposed to the engineer having to go back and put the samples on later. Right. So I think that would also be a real, you know, big benefit to that head. So I'm looking forward to trying that out.
Well, there's so many possibilities. We haven't really discovered all of them, but we're very enthusiastic and excited that we're finally going to show this in a completed form.
Yeah, that's going to be great. Well, great. So for any of these products, if people want to get more information about Aquarian, about yourself, aquariandrumheads.com, correct?
Right.
And for anybody, if they're going to be at NAMM, you know, definitely come by the booth there and check it out. I really appreciate you spending time with us. It was great to talk to you and get your perspective on this. It was very, very interesting and great information for those drummers out there. Well, thanks very much.
Thanks for coming by. I enjoyed it.